I've been thinking about this because there's a website called Large Hearted Boy, and they actually ask writers to write about music that influenced their work. And as I was responding to those questions, I picked 5 pieces of music that I in this book, and talked about why I chose those pieces of music. And a lot of them had to do with music that I had heard as a child. Phil Reese, one of those pieces that most children learn when they're just beginning to learn music, and it was something that one of my brothers used to play all the time. He was incredibly untalented, and but he chose music as one of his electives, and he had to learn this piece, and he only played that piece. And when he finished, the neighbors were just so glad that he had finally taken his exam, because they didn't have to listen to such an uninspired rendition of Phil Reese. But things like that, as I was writing the book, because there were children in the book, and one of them is very musical. Suren, the oldest boy in their family, is very musical. Through him, more and more of the music came in the book. So it wasn't really a conscious addition, but that in following him, it felt to me that I needed to have it, and his family sang a lot, and so it just seemed to come in to every single place that it was possible to.
But also it sort of creates a sense of timelessness, so that even though, the book unfolds roughly chronologically, there's always a sense that there's this foreboding, there's this foreshadowing, there's this instrument or line of melody which is unsettling and disturbing you have a sense of the shape of the book before you actually get to the end. Okay. And I just thought that was completely magical, the way you did that without sort of pounding the reader over the head, or it was very subtly done, and just sort of like just even one string of noise that was a little discordant as you're reading it.
Which also, because the person who's observing what's going on is the road, and so there is this sense that, the choice of the road was also because things had happened before, things would happen later. It would outlast everything that happened down that street, and so the music is also part of that. It's sort of a witness to the music and the sound of that space. Someday it's going to be gone too.
Just the idea of a road animating a novel, I thought was really wonderful. So there are 3 main families: the Harats, or the Perez, the Bowlings with their twins, and their brother Sona, who provides the kind of dark note there in the opening. Have 4 children: the Silvas, Mohan and Jit, old Mrs. Joseph, and Raju, who is the uncle of Sona. And then the Niles, their music teacher, and Mr. Niles, who's sort of observing or listening from the veranda of his house. Now, the texture of your description, as you outline the sort of geography of this road and the families on it, to me, it sort of had the specificity of memory rather than the kind of, imaginativeness of fiction. Now, writers are always sort of distancing themselves from the autobiographical elements of their fiction, or they're completely saying, well, this is entirely autobiographical and very truthful to my life. But can you talk under which pole you sort of gravitate towards?
When I teach, I always say all fiction is non-fiction, because everything comes from, certainly for me, from either an experience I've gone through or something I've vicariously lived through somebody else or overheard somebody talk about. So I feel there is a lot of non-fiction in it, but it is always a sort of a window into a time or some little thing that happened, and then I'm stepping through and inhabiting and trying to extrapolate from. So for instance, growing up, I did grow up down a road that is dead-ended like this. There was a music teacher who lived across the street, but what happens to these people is not what happened to them. And as I'm writing, and as I matured as a writer, I grew to understand how to create, I guess, characters who work for readers rather than put down what I know happens.
Right.
So if I just put down what I know happens, it's not that interesting. I mean, it's interesting, I guess, in the scheme of things to me and people who know me, but it's not really a story. And so in order to create the story, I had to go from there's a music teacher across the road to, oh, the music teacher gives lessons to these kids, and how do they interact with them, and then to have this father, the father of the piano teacher who can't move and only hears what's going on. You know, he can't really see too well either because he's got cataracts, and he's this old man who lies on a chair all day, who's washed and dressed and put in his chair, and he has to understand what's going on down this road from a position of immobility. So, you know, that's all made up. There is no such person. But in order to get there, I did go to, oh, they lived across the street. What could I do with them? And then make something of them.
Now, this is your second novel. Your first novel I haven't read, but let's say it's very different. Now, when you were writing your first novel, or coming to the end of your first novel, and you realized it was like largely finished, and you were thinking about like, you know, when am I going to write another one? How is the next one? How did you describe to yourself how the next one would be different from the first one?
Actually, I don't have an MFA, and I never took any classes in writing, and all the writing that I do comes from reading. So I can't think through a story that I want to write, because if I do, it becomes really boring to me and I can't write it. But I did have this idea. I sort of sit with ideas that I feel I need to write, or this is the story I want to tell, but I don't quite know what it is. One story that I really wanted to tell was this story about my uncle, who is he has had developmental issues, and he was my favorite uncle. And I always felt he was so troubled that he had a very small life, that I really wanted him to have a story, and so I wanted to write about him. So when the first novel finished, I sat down and like, okay, I'm going to write about him. But I do know his story, and I was completely trying to write his story, and it just failed because after about 35 pages, I couldn't go anywhere with it. I realized this was the end of the story. It was a short story, and so it sits there in, you know, in Russian. No. This is a different second book that wasn't the second book. It was a short story. It was in I think World Literature Today as a short story. It's fine, but it wasn't the second book. So then I didn't have a second book. I was just sort of doing stuff. But then the war ended, and I was working on an article for one of the national newspapers here on the end of the war. And as we worked on the piece, as I worked with the editor, I realized that the story that they wanted me to tell was a very black and white story about all the good people and all the bad people, and that was the story of my country, and it's not anybody's story, and I didn't want to write it. So I decided that this needed a novel, and so then that's how this novel.
Okay, so talk about, I mean, this novel is obviously a novel that's going to be very meaningful for your Sri Lankans, especially anyone who came of age during the Civil War, which lasted for 30 years. It totally dominated their whole life. They remember when it began, and of course they'll remember when it ended. But given that Americans or English people or French people or Italian people may not be versed in how it began, they may have a rough idea of the dynamics of the tensions between Tamils and Sinhalese Buddhists, Tamil Hindus and Sinhalese Buddhists, and because you deal so beautifully with, it's not just ethnic conflict, it's class conflict, it's religious conflict. how did you sort of make that sort of breathe for people who weren't completely suffocated by these realities, who, for whom it was an exotic, somewhat confused situation?
So, I do political journalism as well as fiction, and I'm very involved in politics as a civilian, I guess. And I talk and write about war everywhere, in Afghanistan and Pakistan and Iraq and all the wars that we perpetrate as Americans against various people all over the world. And so the book to me is very personal in the sense that I'm talking about things that happen in Sri Lanka, but for many people who do read the book, it really is something that is applicable to many other situations. And so that was what I was actually looking at. I wanted it to be meaningful and be a gesture towards peace and reconciliation for Sri Lankans, obviously. But I also wanted to be, to speak to the fact that when people make policies or people declare war or people go into these kinds of conflicts, what happens to normal people? How do their lives become impacted, and what is really going on? So that was really the focus for me. So maybe that's what helped me to have a little bit of that distance that helps people to work into the story.
On the other hand, we're talking about war, we're talking about hatred, we're talking about violence. This book is so light. This book just sort of breathes lightness. I mean, largely because it's mostly about children and siblings in particular, and their relationships with each other, and their love, deep understanding and love for each other. And that's what just bears the novel aloft, are these sensibilities, and you see them grow, you see them change, and you see them darken. You see this sort of little conflict with these incredibly well-behaved, beautiful children, all of a sudden little conflicts developing with their mother, who seems like an amazing mother, and their father who seems incredibly upright. But just you begin to see them grow, and they actually, it's a real family story. I mean, the war is coming, and it's going to change their lives, but their lives will have been changed in some form anyways. I mean, I have to say, this is just one of the most beautiful books that I've read in such a long time. It's incredibly powerful, incredibly moving in that way.
Well, somebody was asking me, I've been on tour, so I was visiting my oldest readers, that usually when they read books set in times of war, like Rwanda or Malaysia or wherever, that they hear a lot about the terrible things, the terrible atrocities and real descriptions of mayhem and bloodbaths, and there isn't any of that
There's nothing
here.
like that here.
So, and they were asking me why I didn't, and the reason I didn't is because I think we are trained to not pay attention to those details. When we hear 100,000 Iraqis are dead, we say that all the time, and nobody seems to care. But we don't have a name, we don't care about a single Iraqi person that we get to know. And it's when a loss is very personal to us that we start to care about the war and everything else. So I wanted to write a story that created that sense of investment on the part of the reader in somebody that's very personal and small, and in that way come to understand what the war does.
And what was, I really don't want to give away the ending, you'll forget it once you start reading the book, but what's really remarkable about this book is that the darkness when it comes, for the person that you most feel protective of, it comes from a completely, it's not an unexpected direction, but it's something that could happen to any child anywhere. It's not about who she is or what she believes or what kinds of emotions her family inspires in the rest of the neighborhood. But it makes, it has its own logic and it has its own sense of inevitability. And I was so impressed by that decision of yours. It's not to make it something that would be non-narrative, you know, to read. Anyways, that's what I had. In the way of questions, are there readers that or writers that have questions here?
Oh, good.
One thing, in connection with your book about the Savodaya movement in Sri Lanka, if you look, I am going up into 1980 page 117.
I don't write about
There's
Savodaya.
nothing else about it. So I found an interesting anecdote in this nonfiction, Mind is Playing, about Savodaya.
Yeah,
So the end about an anecdote about the man who founded it,
yeah.
and the assassination threat on him and so on. So I just wondered if that was Savodaya.
It isn't in the book.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's all for me.
You mentioned that you do political journalism, so just a question about how you balance, being a reporter and reporting what's there in fiction. What led you to fiction?
So I had always written since I was very little, but that's because I came from a family that read and wrote a lot, and that's just what everybody did, and I didn't know that it was something out there that I had to go get. I just assumed that this is what people did, and so I had always written little things, little letters to the editor, and when I was really very young, and little short stories and bad poetry and all that stuff. I started writing, doing some of the political journalism, in fact, in the States when I was living in northern New Jersey, and I had one daughter, and she doesn't look like me. And everybody thought that I was the nanny because she looked white, and I must be the nanny. So all these parents would just look past me. They never looked at me, but none of the children did. They all knew that I was the mother. And I just, there was one interaction in a bathroom one time after swim lesson, and this woman said, "Oh, are you from Jamaica? Because my friend's nanny is from Jamaica too." And I said, I'm not her nanny, I'm her mother." And it just infuriated me so much that I started writing. I wrote to the paper about how outraged I was by this. Why is it that nobody ever thinks if they see a white woman with a brown child that she must be the nanny? They always assume, well, you must have adopted that child. But for me, it was always I was the nanny. So then, and the paper got very interested in my point of view, and so I started writing more and more to the newspaper. So that's how that began. But I realized that when I write those political things, just like that story I just told, I kind of leave out all the details that might contradict my point of view, because it's opinion pieces and it's freelance, so I'm writing about the things I want to write about, and I know it isn't the whole truth that I'm telling. We all claim that we are objective as journalists, but we're not. We all have an agenda, and sometimes it's useful because you want to speak for a cause, or you need to do that, but it's not the truth of things. And so when I write the fiction, I completely go the other direction in trying to see what it is that's actually going on, and being open to all the people who I would disagree with, vehemently if I was writing a political piece about the same thing. I could write a political piece about everything that happens in this book, and it would be very different. But I'm not after trying to find out the bigger truth when I'm writing those short political pieces.
I've seen your bio that you come from family writers, and I know that a lot of writers get a little worried when they write about maybe things that are close to them, or maybe even base characters off of relatives. And I was just wondering, is your family more accepting of maybe putting details about your past or their past in your writings because they know about writing, and they know that that's the way that fiction works?
No, I'm the youngest in the family. So I've been bullied all my life. I mean, then nobody has taken me very seriously most of my life. But the only person I think who's had issue is my father. And I think, like with this book, I sent him a copy of the book, the review copy, and there was nothing. No, there was silence. And not it's good or it's bad, but there was nothing. And it's because I know he disagrees. He doesn't like that this story is told. And it is not because he doesn't know that these things happen, but that is the generation that were parents at the time that these things happened, and so they feel very guilty. And so there is a whole bunch of people of his generation, Sinhalese parents, who feel guilty and either don't want to talk about it or they want to find explanations for why things happened.
Because they didn't have the answer.
Because they couldn't fix it. They couldn't make it not happen. And then there's a whole set of Tamil parents of his generation who don't want to forgive. So there's a distinct inclination to acknowledge what happened on one side, a distinct inclination to forgive on the other. So there is really it's an impasse in some ways. So some of this, I mean, like this book came out in Toronto at the same time, on the anniversary of the end of the war, and I was going to Toronto, but there was this big hoo-ha about they didn't want to have me come because it was too painful, because there's a whole generation of people who left Sri Lanka who feel very unhappy that the war ended the way it did. So, which is disappointing, but then the person who leads the organization read the book and then wrote to me and said how moved they were and how they felt it was something, it wasn't what they thought it was. So, I'm very hopeful that through something like this, if people are willing to actually look at it, they will.
Have you had meetings where there have been Tamils or somebody in the audience who haven't read the book but have assumed certain things and have called you on it?
Yeah, I mean, they do. I just hold on to the fact that they haven't read the book. There's that. But, I mean, it's not just Tamils. There's sometimes, it's very easy. I've lived in the United States for a long time. I'm a citizen here, dual citizenship. And I know it is very easy to manipulate Americans to do anything. You can get, the expat Iraqi community to send the country to war. You can get the Cuban Miami, population to keep the sanctions against Cuba. You can do a lot of things because there isn't a lot of knowledge about what's actually going on somewhere else. So the thing that really gets my goat, though I don't let it, is those kinds of people who will assume things like, well, we saw the BBC this, so. And something like that. But there's also nice things that happen. Like I was reading in Portland, Oregon, and this woman showed up. She's Tamil, and she's the niece of the mayor of Jaffna, who was mentioned in the prologue, who was murdered by Baba at this temple. And she didn't know anything about this book, and she just picked it up because it was about Sri Lanka, and she started reading the prologue, and she said, "Oh, that's my uncle. I'm going to do this reading." So it was a lovely kind of meeting. We talked about that time and her coming to the U.S. and all of that stuff. So,
And that was like the sort of first event of this.
right. Well, it wasn't the first. There were lots of things. Remember, that was a big.
That was a big one.
Yeah.
Well, I just wanted to ask you something. You didn't get an MFA and you learned sort of writing from reading, and I was just wondering who the writers who've been most important to you, both in general and maybe for this book specifically.
Yeah. Well, this one, there's several books. Chimamanda Adichie's Half the Yellow Sun. I really enjoyed reading, not so much to figure out how to do something, but to know that it can be done. And Abraham Varghese is Cutting for Stone for this book. I mean, thinking about this book, but for this, I mean, I don't have an MFA, and I haven't taken the classes, but I will read craft books. Like so I wrote the book, and then when I was in the editing process, I read Robert Boswell's Half an Old World, and Charlie Baxter's books on plot, and just for little things that I know that I need to think about, and so I know how to go in and look for those things, just because I've read a lot. But in terms of reading as a child, books were really expensive in Sri Lanka, and so we didn't, and I didn't come from a wealthy family, so we couldn't really afford to buy books. But we had these two sources of books. One was this organization in the US called the Asia Foundation, which sends books off to third world countries. So we would get these big boxes of books with stamped, give to the Asia Foundation, and they would be, and we did these boxes and we'd open them up, and they were like geology textbooks and various weird books, but we read them all because they were books. And then, I mean, there was some fiction too, but they weren't the best fiction, whatever, you know. Sometimes, you know, I don't know, Stephen King and all kinds of stuff. And then on the other side, the Soviet Union had this initiative where they had the People's Publishing House in different countries that were favorably disposed towards the Soviet Union, like us. And they would sell beautiful translations of Russian writers, color illustrations for nothing, like a few rupees. So you could buy those. And so I had those, and I had these US books, and so that's what I kind of read as a child. And it's not so, it's just liking books and seeing things in you know, bound like this. I think that's what it comes from, wanting to do the same.
Hi. So thank you for your reading. So I wanted to see if you could talk a little bit about given that you have a background in journalism as well as fiction writing, the benefits versus the dangers of a single story. Because oftentimes we can be moved by a single story, but it doesn't sometimes let us see that other perspective as well, and especially in something like a situation like this.
And I think, I mean, I was at the Penn Festival, Penn World Voices Festival, and they released the report on suppression of writers in China. And we were all asked to give statements about why that is a bad thing. And one of the things I had to say was that same thing, that the history of a country is everybody's story. It's not just this story and you know, one other story maybe, or one thing that fits the government propaganda or something. So, you know, sometimes when people come and they'll talk to me and speak from a different point of view, I suddenly acknowledge that is also a story. You know, it's their story, and they should be able to say it, and all those things together give us a clearer picture of a place, just like here.
And this company, you know, this is not just one story. This is like the story of everyone that lives on that street, and they come from so many different directions.
And I think that is so some, you know, when people ask what is hard about it, I think that is the hard thing, because like I said, I have political opinions about what went on and why it went on and who did what and all of those things. But I really had to say, what did these people actually think? Not what I want them to think or what I hope they felt, but what did they actually think? How did they actually feel? Because I'm Sinhalese, and so I'm not Tamil. So I had to say, what would a Tamil person feel? Even though I'm not that person, and even though I want them to say, oh, everything was fine. Everything wasn't fine. So that was the biggest.
What was the hardest person for you to inhabit in this book?
I mean, they weren't hard. I mean, I loved them all. I really did.
Did you argue with anyone more than another?
I think the easier thing for me to say is one of my favorite characters is Sana, who does such terrible things and is so misunderstood, because he, to me, sort of symbolizes.
Sana is Hama.
No, Sana, he's sort of half, yeah. So Sana, I really loved because he is such a embodiment of so many of us, because we all want something, and most of us are never going to get that thing that we want. We just don't know how to get it, or we do the wrong thing, and we miss something. Yeah, right. Yeah. And so I really liked that about him, even though he does terrible things. And even though in the first draft he really was just a walk-on character, he wasn't a big person in the book. It's just that in subsequent drafts, it just seemed to me that every time I wrote revised. He just became bigger and bigger and bigger. And so clearly I really liked him, even though he didn't know these terrible things.
Yeah, yeah.
You said fiction is about creating characters that work for readers, not necessarily you or your author that close to you. Then how do you go about finding what readers want to transit right now?
I mean, I usually write without knowing where I'm going. I know, I think for a long time, I just think I want to write this story, I want to write this story, but I'm not really thinking about the story directly. So it's sort of a sideways looking at this story that I want to write. So I know, so this is set 1979 to 1983, so I know what's happening historically, 1979 to 1983. So I have that framework, and I know something bad is going to happen, but I don't know what that is, and I kind of keep writing toward that. So as I'm telling myself a story, I'm a reader too. I'm telling myself the story that I might like to read. That's interesting to me. And when I finish that, then I can go back and say, okay, this is not working or that is not working. And I have a very good agent. She does a lot of back and forth before the book even goes out, and she's an excellent reader. She can say, like this book had about 4 or 5 other characters, and they really weren't necessary. And she could say, you know what, those people, we don't need them. Let's get rid of them. And when I look at it, yeah, I don't need them. They were just there because I don't know. I felt like people needed to have children or something, and they were there, and they're sort of distracting. But I had to come to that. I mean, one of the first things I ever wrote, I thought was really great, perfect. But it was a dreadful story. But I didn't know enough to think about how it might read as someone reading a story. It was just what I wanted to put in there and just sort of show off and thing, like, here's all I know, here it is. And my God, it must be grand because I put it down. But as I've gone along, I've come to know that my work doesn't. But she's a large part of it, Julie, my agent.
I'm curious, when you create these characters, do you fully embody them? Do you fully flesh them out outside of the story? Because you only see part of the character in the story. Do you create their whole history outside of your writing to help bring them to life in the story, or you just kind of like how an actor embodies a character? I'm just curious how you go about it.
I just write it. I mean, and then and it's because I don't have the practical training. I think certain people write because they have the practical training through the MFA or whatever, and so they are skilled at doing it that way, but I'm not. And if I think too much, I can't write. I mean, I literally can't do Mad Libs because I don't know adverbs and adjectives and these things, because I know how a sentence ought to sound, but I don't know like the names for the different things, and this must agree with that and all this stuff. Because if I start thinking about that, I can't spell sometimes, and I just get all tied up and I can't progress. So to think about a character wholly would be just deadly. That would be the end of that character. There'd be no other ones that have to go.
One last question? Well then, let's go drink and buy books.
Thank you.